Oh, Chester,
Oh, hi, Adrian. How are you?
I got that carrot you wanted. Can I hand that through to you?
Yeah, give it a shot.
Okay, here we go. Here we go. Ah, there we go. Good.
Awesome. Well, that's a fun way to start this session. I love starting with fun. And I just want to again reiterate our appreciation for all of you on the line and to our distinguished panelists for joining us today for our next installment of the virtual conference series, Rebels with a Heart, the New Rules of Leadership. And as always, it's a very appropriate time for this topic. And as always, we have great speakers that bring a diverse perspective and ideas on how these times are affecting organizations, their leadership skills, their people, and how our values continue to evolve as we will build together in the context of business. So with that, I will introduce each of our panelists and then we'll open up for an energetic conversation. So Lori, why don't we start with you and you can give your background introduction. So thanks for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Derek. My name is Lori Shakur, and I'm the head of HR for Rakuten. We're an online e-commerce company. I won't even go into my background. I'll just say that I'm a shared rebel with a heart, and I'm looking forward to spending time with each and every one of you today. We as HR practitioners have such a unique position today. This is our time. This is our season to guide our teams, to support our leaders, and to give a message of encouragement and compassion.
Thank you for that intention. That's wonderful. And you do have a distinguished background, which we'll get into as well throughout the call. So thanks for being here. Chester, we'll come over to you. I think you also have a pretty large introduction to share with everyone. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, usually I like my mom to do that for me. She does such a great job. I really want to emphasize and agree with Lori. You know, Adrian Gostick, my co-author, who you'll meet in just a second, we've been studying leadership in teams and cultures for 20 years now. We have a database of over 1 million engagement surveys where we draw some really interesting conclusions and provide tools for people. I just want to say though, Lori, I couldn't agree with you more that the HR profession now, I mean, that is where generally the heart of an organization is cared for. And never more have we needed our hearts to be cared for more than right now. And so I really do hope that the HR professionals and the CEOs that partner with them on our call today get some great takeaways, because never before has the playing field been so level. CEOs are working from home and they've got kids, and now we all get, you know, how difficult this is. And with that, I know you're going to pass the baton to Adrian Gostick, who I always say I'm Robin to his Batman. He is the writer, the heart and the soul of our business, and I'm proud to call him my friend for well over 20 years now.
Awesome. Well, Adrian, that's a great tee up for you. And thank you as well for being here.
Well, thanks, Derek. And Lori, we're honored to be on the panel with you. And thanks, everybody for joining. Chester and I, we've been, as he mentioned, we've been researching and writing on leadership subjects and working with HR professionals for the last 20 years. And, you know, we keep hearing this phrase, never before has, but it really hasn't. Never before have HR professionals been more needed. We need that heart within the organization. So, you know, some of our books include books like The Carrot Principle and All In, and latest book was called Leading with Gratitude. But as we've been working lately, really quickly here, we've been writing a lot on anxiety and increasing mental stress that's on people in the workplace. So we'll talk about that as we go forward.
Wonderful. Thank you again. That's such a perfect direction. Again, I'm Derek Lunston, CEO of Life Guides, and we're building a platform and a community for caring people to be connected, to help work through and navigate life's challenges, to be happier, healthier, at both at work and at home, and ultimately to create a healthier community at large. So with that, I think that's a great jump off point. I think it's exciting to have both, you, Lori, in the practical day-to-day leadership, of the HR professional, and then this background of science and knowledge and an expertise that Chester and Adrian bring, kind of profiling this rebel leader we've talked about, this servant leader, and really establishing what we're considering this culture of caring. And so with that, why don't we dig into a little bit of the research? I think that's a good place to start, because that'll probably lead us in all sorts of fun areas. So, you mentioned 20 years, Chester, and millions of different data points. Talk to us about really what distinguishes leaders who are thriving in this time of what many are calling crisis, or the combination of crises. What's setting people apart right now, setting leading cultures aside?
You know, great question, and obviously no simple answers. I'll tell you what we have discovered in our research, in our database, and interviewing, you know, countless CEOs and CHROs, is that leaders that are good communicators, right? We've looked and said, look, in a crisis, what really needs to accelerate? And we found that there were two areas in particular. One is communication. You know, you've got to communicate. And as we've studied organizations going through, whether it was the last recession or this recession, they got to the point where they were communicating every day. And the critical thing to know there is that when you don't communicate and you have that void gets filled, right? And it gets filled with rumor, innuendo, and fear. And none of those are comforting and none of those are productive. The second thing that really needs to accelerate, and we found this fascinating, and although an affirmation of a lot of our work, is gratitude needs to go up. This idea of thanking people for the sacrifices they're making, for the pivots they've had to make, the changes, working from home or working with masks or whatever it might be, being more careful with travel, and that celebrating these small wins and celebrating people. And what happens there is, again, it's tied to communication. What you're telling people is you're not forgotten, you know, that you do matter, that what you are doing is contributing to the overall mission of the company. And so it was really fascinating to us that the leaders that could communicate, be vulnerable, you know, admit when they didn't know something, but they would help you get that answer. And at the same time, infused it all with this sense of thank you so much for the sacrifices you're making, were two big discoveries that we came through in crisis. And, you know, Adrian, what would you add to that? I mean, you know, we interviewed American Express CEOs and WD-40, and they all had kind of the same take, which was really refreshing.
They did, and I'm just interested because I see Lori nodding her head. And so from the practical standpoint, this is what our research shows. Do you find that communication and gratitude, you know, really does drive, you know, sort of our help in these troubled times?
Absolutely. And the reason I smile is you've obviously spoken to leaders that are assuming a best practice. What I could share is it was a heavy lift initially, because dealing with leaders, they're humans too. And so they couldn't deal with the ambiguity. They couldn't come up with their leadership message. I challenged a number of my leaders early on to come up with what I'm calling their continuity message. In the midst of all of the ambiguity and uncertainty, what do we know for sure? And so many of my leaders struggled with that. We've now turned a little corner, but there's still so much ambiguity. So the communication isn't quite there. The vulnerability, yet another opportunity that I've seen. Mm-hmm. Leaders don't like exposing themselves. And so we've been doing, myself and my HR business partner team have been working closely with the leaders to have them hold up the mirror and say, we don't have any time anymore. We don't have the luxury of them trying to hold up some illusion of being separate. We're all going through an inconvenience, a major pandemic, civil unrest at the same time. So I smiled because everything you've said makes sense. And I can see once it's adopted and implemented, it works. But the challenge or the true opportunity is getting our leaders there. And we're still working on that.
So along those lines, I want to actually dig in a little bit further on that specific point around vulnerability, both from what you're seeing in your organization, Lori, and also with peers that you see in the Sherman community, but also what you gentlemen are seeing. I think that's, you know, back to life guides and the idea of opening up to what's challenging us, what's causing us concern, to use the phrase, what's keeping us up at night. I mean, there's so many challenges now, and the virtual walls have come down, and we're literally, our lives are being blurred between work and home, and the responsibilities from all those different areas. You know, how are you seeing your leadership really, you know, lean into this? How are they communicating? What are they saying? And what are you training them on how to be more vulnerable while still providing the confidence and the sense of certainty that we're going to work together to understand the solutions that are going to bring us forward? And then how are you seeing the ones, again, the rebels, what are they doing differently that's really moving things forward, like bucking the trend?
So I can take a stab. I don't necessarily have rebels yet, but I'm building them. Again, it started with baby steps. And so I'm a big believer in leveraging the existing frameworks and processes. So for us, it started at the beginning of the pandemic, really looking at our goals and objectives. I know that sounds crazy, but one of the first things we did was we communicated to employees that we're going to adjust our objectives and we're going to remove the employee aspect of the formula when we look at our bonuses. So we're ignoring the operational aspect and company performance and only focusing on individual employee performance. It was as though we received a universal sigh of relief because employees were so concerned about their bonuses. So we removed that. The next process we leveraged, we typically do a quarterly check-in. Then we did wellness check-in. So instead of ensuring that we were aligned with goals and objectives, we just wanted to make sure people were okay. And we did the normal things that other companies did with stipend to make sure our offices were set up. Most recently with the mid-year process, we hosted a mid-year process. We recalibrated our goals and objectives. We had managers lean in and talk more around behaviors instead of achieving goals. So we're looking at who's not taking vacation time. I know we can't go anywhere, but we're holding managers accountable to ensure that their employees take time off. And we're incentivizing that by take 4, get 1 free. I know that sounds crazy, but we're doing that. We're also encouraging managers to get out of the window of a normal operating time. We're a global company. And so we're tasking leaders to look globally and identify ways that we can partner, because if we've got employees that have small children, they may not be able to work a traditional day. And so we're now passing off some assignments and tasks midday to other global teams so that we can still complete. And I think our third critical piece is we're really doubling down on some of our offerings. So like the wonderful tool that Derek's organization has created and other tools to just make sure employees have enough resources at their disposal. So we over communicate the importance of well-being first and foremost. We still talk about the work and we encourage our leaders to be, I don't want to say creative, but nimble in how we get the work done, but we really focus on, we want people to feel safe, and we're focusing on well-being and just team and supporting each other. So
that's great. So I'm going to come back to you guys in just 1 second, because I could see, Adrian, you want to chime in, but I want to say one of the things I heard around communication is you're listening, right? A big part of communication is really listening, and you're listening, your leaders are listening to what your people need, and you're changing the rules, right? Everything you change as solutions are things that you're doing differently, that you adapted in real time, that are completely different from how you were doing things before. And that is fairly rebellious in a heart-centered way. You are responding to make sure that your people are cared for. And I think that goes back to the team element, which is where I wanted to come back to you, Adrian and Chester. I mean, you guys have done a lot of work, not just on leaders, but teams and the team dynamic. And that's some of your concepts. Maybe you can share a little bit about how what Lori shared in practice is some things that you've seen and have measured and are seeing now with the companies you're working with.
What I love as you explain that, Lori, is how detailed your response has been. Unfortunately, we were talking with a lot of HR people. We're 6 months in, and they're still sort of figuring this out. Obviously, you've been very thoughtful, and your team, so well done on that. One of our favorite CEOs we work with is actually Kent Taylor, who's the CEO of Texas Roadhouse. 80,000 employees around the world, 600 locations here in the U.S. And during this pandemic, Texas Roadhouse hasn't actually laid off people. 3 million people out of work in the U.S. restaurant industry, and they're hiring at Texas Roadhouse. And it's because he says, and this whole idea that you talked about, rebels. Kent is such a believer in rebels that he says the first thing you do when, especially rebels with a heart, he says the first thing you do when you go through a crisis like this is you start calling your rebels, because I guarantee they're already trying to do things that'll make you money, that'll keep the lights on. Wow. He says, your rule followers, he says, they're pretty much petrified by this point. They don't know what to do. And he says, you've got to couple your rebels with your, he calls them puppies on the porch, and help them understand it's okay. I just loved what Lori talked about. We're going to do things in a different way. We're going to reevaluate our ideas. And by doing this, Kent came up with, from his people, lots of ideas to to sell, raw steaks to people, to kind of, opening up curbside, which they'd never done before, to having family markets outside. It was lots of exciting ideas. So we just saw a week ago that they were named as the #1 restaurant in the entire country during the pandemic. Why? Because they embraced their rebels.
It's incredible. It's incredible. Chester, I can see you're sitting there with a grin on your face. Anything you want to add to that question?
Yeah, again, the specificity that Lori talks about is so key, because you can talk in platitudes unless you give people real specifics and the details. They still don't know what to do. I was just yesterday with Lockheed Martin, their missile and fire control guys, and it really interesting is they start to adjust. They said, look, we got a lot of people working from home, and say, look, here's the deal. We expect you to work a 40-hour week. Now, if you want to work 4 10-hour days, that's fine. If you want to make 7 6-hour days, we get an extra 2 hours. And they've really embraced something we wrote about in our book called Assume Positive Intent. Mm-hmm. And it's that, look, I know that when people don't get back to me right away, which they used to, there's probably something going on, and it's okay. Yeah. It's okay. I'm going to assume positive intent that maybe you're dealing with schooling your kids or tech problems or whatever, and that you will get to it. And he's so funny. One of the things that I think, with leaders that you have to really hammer home is they can't just say it, they have to do it. I'm talking to one of the leaders at Lockheed Martin, and he says, we tell people, do not work on the weekend. Take that time. He says, now, I do. Yeah, well, you got to stop doing that. And he says, well, one of the things I do is I say, and it's kind of funny because I remember this as a kid, at Christmas with the tag on the don't open until Christmas. He says, if I work on the weekend, I say, don't open this until Monday, or don't respond until Monday. He says, so I'm getting there. The point is that, Ken Taylor at Texas Roadhouse, he empowers his rebels because they know he's a rebel. Mm-hmm. And the way he acts gives them permission. So again, as you start going through this and you're listening to it as a leader, don't just say it. You have to do it. Yeah. And it has to be emphatic, because the way you act is the way you give permission for everyone else to act. And I think that's really key.
So using Ken as an example, I obviously got some examples of what the business has done, but what is he personally modeling? What is he doing? What has he done consistently that people just see it and they understand, okay, this is what rebel leadership looks like, right? Or heart-centered rebel leadership looks like, right?
One of the things that I was really impressed, and we had a chance to be on Ken's calls, his daily calls with his executive leadership team. So it's been a real honor for us to be a part of that. One of the things that he really shows is compassion. So, for example, during Father's Day, their computer system went down. I mean, it must have cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars in orders. People show up at the restaurant, well, we didn't get your order. And so Monday morning, we're on the call where the head of the IT department is on the call with all of the operators. And in most companies, what would be happening? They'd be finger pointing. How in the world could this happen? That's not what happened on this call. They said, look, the first thing that Ken said was, look, nobody wanted that computer system to go down. I appreciate our IT guys running in on Father's Day to coming in and fixing everything and getting us back up and running. I appreciate that. Now, no finger pointing. What can we do to make this, to learn from this and make this a learning opportunity? And it was a great moment as they talked for the next hour about ideas that they could do to build duplicate systems and do this, that, and the other. And they came out at the end as a better company. And what I loved that there was absolutely no pointing of fingers. They used it as a learning moment, and it made their company better.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in, and I want to bring Lori into this conversation as well, because one of the reasons Texas Roadhouse was able to deal with this pandemic like no other restaurant, and in many cases like no other company that we've seen, is because up front they had such a healthy culture. It wasn't like when a crisis hit, all of a sudden you say, trust me, and everybody goes, oh, well, crisis, and now we trust you. He has always taken care of his employees. Now, if you work at Texas Roadhouse, you're a roadie. I love that. You got roadies and your customers and your community, and they are in that order. They have known for 20 years that Kent will take care of them first. And knowing that they're safe, that they get what the deal is, that they're going to feed their communities. They're going to do it in a way that's not only going to keep us working, it's going to keep feeding our customers and service our community. Well, when you've got the order right, it makes all the difference. So knowing that he always had their backs when it came to this crisis, they weren't surprised, they were more energized and more engaged. And so, Lori, I'd love for you to talk about the power of culture bringing you through a crisis and how that has helped you in your work.
Oh, geez, culture. We've had to redefine culture. And you bring out an outstanding point, because for us, whatever was wrong and broken before was emphasized and exaggerated in a pandemic. So our gaps in opportunity for leadership development, oh boy, has it shown up. Mm-hmm. Our lack of empathy previously, oh boy, has it shown up. The thing that was broken before, it's been as though a huge mirror has been lifted up and we've got to look. And so in recognition of that, we've had to double down and really focus on just slowing down. The acumen of dealing with ambiguity, even though it's a technology company, it wasn't a strong behavior. And so we literally had to, and I keep emphasizing this, what's our continuity message? What do we know for sure? And then having the leaders, and I can share, we made one mistake that I'm certain other companies made. Early out, we said there won't be any people let go. That's one of the things first time going through a pandemic, if we ever go through another, I recognize you probably want to pause with any broad messages around what you're going to do. And that's one really major opportunity, because we've had to look at our business operating model and make some tough decisions. We recently sunset an entity that we own, buy.com. And so when I think of what was broken before, I'm thrilled to say, while it's been difficult, we're coming out on the other side much stronger. So our leaders now recognize their vulnerabilities, and they see now how all the coaching and encouragement that we were doing before pandemic is really necessary and essential now. And so they're taking up and they're recognizing the power and the shadow that they cast. And so they're being much more mindful of their behaviors. They're being much more mindful of their voice and their tone and the timing in which they host meetings. But it's only because we had some gaps and some opportunities that we just didn't get an opportunity to clean up. But now we're forced. Our hand has been called, and we've got to come up and really step up. And it's demanding a lot from HR. It really is. And my business partners are looking around, because again, we've got to move faster than we ever thought we would have. And we've had a number of gaps and opportunities before that have been magnified, but thankfully now we're coming up with a mitigation plan that involves mentoring, coaching, focused and targeted leadership development, and really emphasizing the opportunity for our leaders to be much better.
Yeah. So I want to dig in on something. So thank you for sharing that. A couple of things. So one is, we talked early on that today is, Women's Equality Day here, right? And I think that's a lot of the topics that you mentioned around empathy, around compassion that Adrian mentioned, around some of these softer, or what have been historically considered softer skills with more feminine skills. I attribute to the fact that we're seeing more and more numbers of women in leadership roles, and that intelligence is being shared across organization. How do you see the role of women leaders influencing during this time? And this is a question for all of you. As because I think it changes. I think there's the old model is we're going to get through this. We're going to power through it. That's that masculine intelligence. Then you've got that feminine, which is we're going to listen, we're going to respond, we're going to nurture, we're going to care, and fusing those together in a way that provides the greatest number of people to coalesce around that mission. I think that's what's really exciting, and where this is coming together. So I'd love to hear your all thoughts on that as well. And thank you again, Lori, for being here today.
So I count my blessings every day. I am so uniquely blessed, and as is Rakuten employees. Our US-based CEO, and we've got, who's a male, and we've got a female chief operating officer. Now I've got over 30 years experience, and this is the first time that my two senior most leaders have been a male and a female. And I know that the level of compassion and empathy and a desire to really create a meaningful experience for our employees is driven by both of them. And it doesn't hurt that both of them are also parents. So this shared experience, and you led with that, Derek, we're all going through it at the same time. And so I feel really blessed and humbled. And I know unequivocally that having a woman in that senior seat has dramatically changed the ecosystem. So she's brought in things like care.com in anticipation of parents needing and people needing elder care. She's doubled down and asked that we really look at all of our processes from a cultural and generational way so that we can really have an inclusive organization. But it hasn't just been her voice. It's been her and the male CEO. Yeah. So I 100% agree that in my experience, I've never seen this level of compassion. But I think I'm also lucky that I work for a company that has a senior female leader.
Yeah. And I'll take it a step further. It's you know, male, female, but even just the whole concept of diversity in teams, right? Just the different backgrounds, different ideas, different approaches to problems, different backgrounds. I think that's also created a culture for these rebels with a heart to surface. That allows for that debate. It allows for a healthy conversation. I mean, Chester, Adrian, what do you gentlemen think about this part of the conversation in terms of what you've seen in your research and how you're seeing, you know, these companies adapt in this time?
You know, we interviewed Indira Nooyi, PepsiCo, you know, great leader. And actually, people don't know, a great athlete. She played for the Indian national cricket team, which, you know, so, you know, caring parent and the whole bit, as well as very competitive. And I think that's one of the things that you see when you give everyone a voice. And I think for so long, females and women executives didn't feel like they had a voice. So I love what Lori says about, you know, when a crisis hits, that's when the spotlight really does shine on where are your deficits. You know, when you're going great and profits are great and you're hiring and expanding, it covers a lot of sins. You know, it just does. You hit a crisis and all of a sudden you really do take a look at where are we and who do we need in what places. You know, Adrian and I talk often about great leaders asking questions like, how are you doing today? Mm-hmm. Right? Because today could be very different than yesterday. How can I help? And then one of the great questions, I think, of good leaders, and I think a lot of this has come from the influence of more senior female leaders, is what do you think? Because they weren't often asked that question and they want to be more inclusive. And when you ask employees, you know, whether they're younger generationally or from, you know, different socioeconomic situations or parents or non-parents or female or male or whatever it might be, when you ask that question, what do you think? And you give them voice. And I think that's why it's really important we have today's like today that celebrate women and say, you know, we're asking you, how can we be better at this? And then, of course, the next step is listen.
And I would add too, that's a great point. And you know, it's terrific. Well, just listening to what Lori had to say there. And one of the things that you mentioned a little earlier was about mentorship, because sometimes, you know, some of the listeners may be going, look, we don't have enough women in positions perhaps that they need to be right now. And that's where this idea of becoming an ally for people like Chester and I on this, it really is being able to spot talent that's coming up and being able to give women an opportunity to really shine. One of the things I get to do every year, and I was scheduled to this March, and of course it got canceled, was to go, I give sessions on culture at the Women's Food Service Forum. So they have about 3,000 women in food service leadership show up every year. And they have some really big hitters speaking, like Maya Angelou spoke, and Brené Brown, and others. And what has really been cool is that about 10% of the attendees are male senior leaders. And they're going there to help support the women in their care. They're actually, I mean, talk about rebel behavior. They are doing those things that they should be doing to lift women up. So I thought that was a great example that I've seen.
That's super powerful. Thank you for sharing, Adrian. And I completely agree. That's why I asked the question, because I think that's part of this whole modeling. We need to demonstrate exactly what we're talking about and approaching that firsthand. One of the questions that came from the audience, which you all touched on briefly, and I'll bring it back, I think it's a great question, is how do you shift cultures that are not already filled with gratitude and engaging leadership, right? So we're all fortunate that we've seen a lot of the exemplars of what this looks like. What about the other side of it? How do we create the culture of rebellion in a heart-centered way that allows people to heal the wounds, heal the sins, if you will, that you guys talked about?
You know, we talk about, you've got to dispel the myths. we buy into so many of these myths as leaders, particularly in a crisis. We say, well, that's the soft stuff, the gratitude. That's a nice to have.
Right.
When in reality, it's the hard stuff and it's an absolute must have, right? So we dispel a lot of rumors. Our research showed us that, a lot of leaders lead by fear. Now, many of them don't realize they're doing it. And that's the danger, right? They have a lot of passive aggressive language like, look, I don't want to scare anybody. I just got to tell you, if we don't hit the budget, I'm not sure I can, secure your jobs next quarter. I'm being open, honest, and transparent. Yeah, it's scaring the crap out of everybody at the same time, right? Or the old, adage that, look, get the compensation right. It's all about the Benjamins, and we'll be fine. Where, when we look at healthy cultures, I've got to believe what I do matters, that I make a difference. And then when I make a difference, that somebody noticed it and celebrated it. And so we talk about these myths. You got to dispel those, and then you get into the numbers, and you just show them examples of, like, Alan Mulally saved the Ford Motor Company in the last recession, and he did it by saying to his leadership in a completely dysfunctional culture at Ford, it's all about your people. You got to love them up. I mean, and then these guys are like, what? And then his actions, right, where he unveiled the new Taurus, which was part of their big comeback story. And on the stage in front of the automotive world, he said, isn't this a beautiful car? Look at how clean and shiny. Who shined that car? And brings up the 3 guys who polished the car to say, we're all in this together. So the way you kind of turn it around, I know Adrian's got many more ideas. I think you got to start with, look, get rid of the myths and these disclaimers that fear and money and all that, or I don't have time, have no place. Show them the most rigorous leaders that held people accountable, were competitive, got things done, and, oh, by the way, were some of the most compassionate leaders. Alan Mulally at Ford, I mean, if you can do it with the UAW, when he took over, they had 20% engagement. When he left, they had over 90% engagement, and that included the UAW. I mean, that's a story that's just irrefutable, right? And so you kill them with the numbers, you give them the examples, and then you give them the tools. Like Lori said, you got to get very specific. Here's how we're going to do it. And we outlined that in our research as well.
One of the things I think I would add too is this idea of, the stress that people are under right now. The latest statistics show from just a month ago that about half of Americans are feeling some level of mental health disorder, whether it's through depression, through anxiety. This is huge right now. And if we are ignoring this as leaders, we are going to lose people, and we are never going to recover from this. And it's always going to take a long time. So one of the things, and unfortunately, we have a little bit of a default to EAP. Lori in HR unfortunately knows this because it can be really powerful. But if a manager says, yeah, call the number, that's not what I need from you. I need that number, but I also need you to be a support to me, to be able to listen to me, to be able to take me through the uncertainty that I'm feeling. And you might not be able to give me all the answers I need, but we can walk through the uncertainty together.
So thank you for sharing the value proposition of Life Guides, Adrian. You made my job very easy. And it actually tied in very nicely with one of the questions that came from the audience, which is, do you have specific suggestions on how leaders can support emotional and mental health beyond just encouraging people to take time off or EAP programs? And again, Life Guides aside, because this is not a pitch, how else would you recommend that leaders and cultures provide the resources to the people that they need during this time?
So we've done all the usual, Modern Health, Thrive, looking at Life Guides. But we're also, and particularly in our European offices, we've got mental health licensed practitioners. Mm-hmm. And they're also offered in the US. So you can get HR practitioners or managers or even individual contributors to be trained on how to identify and determine if there are mental health challenges in the workplace. So that's one of the things that we researched and we've implemented. Equally important, and aside from anything, we're telling our leaders, and our leaders are managing this very well. We're literally doing the check-ins. And I love the question of, how are you today? Mm-hmm. And we're being very mindful if people are typically on the camera, if they're not on the camera, if So changes in patterns and behaviors. We're coaching our leaders to be mindful and notice, not to be intrusive, but to pay attention. Our employees are giving us direct feedback that they're feeling, although we're remote, that they're much more visible to their managers than they ever have been. Now, granted, some of them are saying, my manager keeps telling me to turn my camera on, and I know that's HR telling them to say that, and I'm not camera ready, but that's a lot better than someone having previously been off camera and we not noticing. So I'm grateful, although we're making tiny steps with the utilization, because there's still a stigma. There's still a stigma around the support that EAP and other programs like that offer, which is why we're looking at other ways so that we can remove any stigma and we can make it a part of our business as usual going forward. So we check in regularly, and we've embedded that as just a part of every meeting. We now know that we're going to start 5 minutes late because we just want to pause and say, how is everyone?
You know, I want to add to that. I think the way, you know, people saying examples of how to do it right. You know, I wish I could remember the name of the company. I was interviewing a practitioner and said, you know, one of the best examples of helping people get there with mental health is when the leader shares their experiences. And he told a great story about a leader who was dealing with cancer in the middle of a merger and acquisition. And while she was in the hospital, again, coming back to empowered women, right? She literally wrote 2 letters to her employees. The one was, if I don't make it, here's what I want you to remember. And the other one is, if I make it, here's what we want to do. I mean, and then she shared that story. It wasn't, and she did make it, by the way, so there was a happy ending. You know, she shared the story that, look, I was on death's doorstep. And I wanted you to know that not only was I taking care of my family, that was the most precious thing to me, you were on my mind. And I wanted you to know that whether I survived or not, you were going to be okay. Well, when a leader shares that kind of vulnerability in dealing with sickness, mental health, you know, I love leaders that just say, I got to take a day off. Remember, Adrian, we had Chris from HR Leaders who said, look, I was interviewing someone about mental health and admitted on air to all my employees that I'd been struggling with anxiety for years. He said it got so bad. It was a great line that we used in the book. He said, my anxiety got so bad, I got anxious about thinking about being anxious, you know? Well, he then gave his people permission. And one of the things Lori mentioned that I think is so key is track people's time off. If they're not taking any time off, you've got to get to them and say, look, I get that you think the company can't survive without you. I've got bad news. We can't. You've got to take some time off. You know, I think that leader being vulnerable and sharing those stories, then when you go to the EAP line, it's okay.
Because there's got to be, you're right, because that's one of those clues that this person may not be doing well. If they've never taken any time off in the last 6 months, they may be in a little bit of a state of anxiety, panic themselves. So there are a few clues that somebody can look for, because right now, again, the data says about 90% of employees do not feel comfortable talking to their boss about their mental health issues. That's a huge number, which basically says, that's just about everybody. It says, I don't want to talk about it at work. So you're right, we've got to start with vulnerability ourselves and talk about, these are the things that are hitting me. I mean, isn't it crazy trying to do this or this, balancing home and life, and you know the kids are coming in, and you got to talk about it yourself. You've got to start those conversations, because you got to assume, I'm guessing right now, probably half the people that you're in your employ are dealing with some really hard stuff, and they're not telling you about it.
And Derek, you've probably seen this too. I mean, you break your ankle, you take time off.
Right.
You get overly stressed, you power through.
Yeah.
You know, because you can't talk about it, because it's a sign of weakness. Listen, I remember early in my career, I was going through tremendous stress. And I was talking to our head of HR, who was a dear friend of mine. And she said, hey, do you want some counseling? I said, absolutely not. She said, why? I said, I would never want that in my jacket.
Right.
And she goes, Chester, you got to, I said, stop, not going to happen. I'll deal with it. Right. Tremendously unhealthy. It's miraculous, actually, I've turned out as well as I have.
No, it's so true. I mean, it is, and it does start with leaders showing it, right? It goes back to they need to be willing to do it. I think even what we're seeing, the companies that the leaders embrace this idea and do it themselves, that it gives permission, it makes it acceptable, it changes the relationship dynamic. But even beyond that, because it's not just about the work, it's not just EAP, but how do we make it okay for people? I mean, we're living in a time of social isolation. We're technically connected, but we're not as personally connected. I think when we are so, there's all this perception of what we're supposed to be or how we're supposed to act. And how do you, that goes back to that rebel concept. How does it just become okay? And what's the format to just bring that to the surface, right? I think that's part of the transformation that I think humanity in some ways is going through right now, right? I think that's, in many ways, that's what this time, the great pause, if you will, is forced. It's like, you need to look at this. The entire society is being confronted with a mirror that says, you need to slow down, you need to look inward, and you need to go back to the connection of what makes us special and unique as a human being. And I think that, and business has continued to go on. We found ways to adapt, and yet the core elements of why we do what we do and how we do it together are fundamental. And that's where the questions are right now. And I think that's really, really compelling. So I think you've given us all a lot to think about in that. And I think let's take it a step even further. How do we model this for our children, right? We're all parents or all friends of parents. One of the questions that came in is, how do we see this caring and compassion concept playing out in our school system to make it safer for our teachers, staff, and students? Do we have examples of who's doing this right? We're talking about business, but again, the lines are becoming more and more blurred. And even education and the concept of companies is becoming more and more blurred. How do we prepare people for the workforce of tomorrow, right? That's a big topic right now. So how does that play out on a more systemic level? And we talked about this previously, Chester and Adrian, in one of our conversations, but I'd love you to share what you think about this with the audience, and you too, Lori. Obviously, in the Bay Area, this is a hot topic right now, so.
Lori, I think it's your turn.
Okay, no worries. So we've got a pretty decent population of employees that have small school-age children. So early in, we and those, the CEO and the COO also have small school-age children. So early into the pandemic, we actually made a decision not to go back into the office. We out the gate, I want to say April, we were whispering it and saying we just wouldn't go. And the reason we made that decision to say unequivocally, globally, we won't try to go into the offices, recognizing that there would be so much uncertainty around school and caring for kids. Mm-hmm. So that was the first thing. We've removed the anxiety that parents may have around how would they deal with their children going to school and them not going into the office. So we've removed that. We've also doubled down with being really, really flexible and open with parents and recognizing that it cannot be business as usual. So as an HR team and leaders, we've said, if the child comes in the room, don't shoo them away, pick them up, bring them into the meeting. And I said this early on because although I'm blessed, my young people are young adults and they're dealing with college, but I wouldn't want young children to view mom and dad working as a negative. Yeah. They're locked outside of some room and they can't see because mom and dad aren't home, and now they're home. And why aren't they interacting with their children? Because of this thing called work. Right. So we've been very fluid, and our meetings are just circuses. We've had kids bring in their balloon toys and it's just playing with mom and dad's hair and putting on hats. But we just plowed through because we don't want to create a culture, at least within our environment, where the kids of our employees don't like the idea of Rakuten. They don't like the idea of mom and dad working. And we also do daycares, so meaning parents that all have children, they bring their kids together and have lunch. So we're trying to be as creative as possible to create an environment that is inclusive. I know that sounds crazy, but inclusive of family, because no longer is it, I go to work. Yeah. Work is happening right here at home. So how do we blend it? Yeah. Is the best thing that we've at least tried so far.
I love it. We, in fact, one of our previous Rebel sessions, we actually had one of our panelists' kids join the call during the session. That's happened, I think, even more than once. And my daughter joins at least one meeting a day at this point. So, I mean, it's just, she loves coming to work. And that's awesome. So thank you for sharing that, Lori. It's great to hear what your organization is doing. Chester, Adrian, you guys have thoughts on the initial question or anything that Lori said about the workforce culture?
You know, I think a couple of things. You know, I just love hearing what you've said, Lori. I mean, your practical advice is so powerful. Couple of thoughts. One is that, you know, with kids with these kinds of situations, you've got to be open and honest, but also not create this panic within them. We see just these extremes. Unfortunately, we're a very divisive culture right now. We have people who are making, you know, this is the worst thing, and others that are, you know, it's all a hoax, right? We've got all this. And so you've got to be very open and honest and communicate very, very openly, honestly with them. Like Lori, my son's college age too, and he was about to enter master's programs, and he didn't feel safe. He was accepted to some big schools, and basically the plan was, well, come on back, we'll figure it out. And it wasn't good enough. And so this relates to not only colleges, but it relates to our workplaces too. You've really got to give people the plan. Saying, come on, we'll figure it out, you know, put on a mask, and it isn't good enough. You've really got to help people feel, and young people especially, feel safe, but also not panicky.
You know, I want to add to that too. And Derek, you'd mentioned something earlier about dealing with how different things are. You know, it's interesting, isolation. You know, let's not discount that. You know, we talk about families and whatnot. Well, we got some single people that are isolated. I think, Derek, it was you that related to us that you had an employee who was a grandma, and she said, I haven't had a hug in 3 months. Well, you know, that's, if you're a grandma and you got grandkids and you haven't been able to hug your grandkids in 3 months, I mean, you know, you need to be sensitive to that. And what I loved about that story that you told, Derek, is that you knew that. You know, you'd had a conversation and there was something that was off, and she felt comfortable enough to share with you, yeah, I'm struggling because. Well, once you know that, and then you can figure out ways to kind of mitigate that. I'll tell you, through all of this, the companies that do it right, you know, a lot of the things that Lori has shared and some of the best practices and clearly using a lot of your tools, Derek, is that when you come out of this, the loyalty factor is going to be unbelievable. Because, you know, you think of the employees at Texas Roadhouse, you think those people are going to work at another restaurant for 50 cents more an hour? It's never going to happen. You know, that they took care of me in my deepest and darkest time. And boy, I'm telling you what, you know, we saw this happen with WD-40 in the last recession. Gary Rich invested in his people and said, we're going to get through this together. He has this tribal culture. Well, once they came out of it in 2010, I mean, in the subsequent years, they went from a $280 million company to $2.8 billion. You know, in anybody's books, that's good growth. You know, and how did it happen? It's because in a crisis, he took care of his people first. And when the crisis passed, his people took care of the company and their customers. It's a tried and true formula. And it's amazing how many leaders don't still get it.
I think it's timely you bring that up in a couple of different levels. I mean, so yesterday, right, was Salesforce, Mark Benioff, they had their earnings call, right? And they had, during this time, one of their best years ever. They're on track to skyrocket. And they've been very out in front regarding work from home, time off for parents, additional leave time, caring for their employees, and the whole Ohana concept. I mean, that's in your backyard, Lori. I mean, they're investing in the schools, they're investing in the community. I mean, I don't know Mark personally, but I mean, everything I see of what he's modeling around this concept of stakeholder capitalism, I mean, he's out there putting his actions with what he's saying. I would say that, you know, because that was an example that literally yesterday, here we are, and they're having a banner quarter and a banner year, because they've been cultivating that for the last decade, arguably. I mean, when you talk to their people, they have built, their culture really is what they're espousing to the world, right? And now here they are in a tough time, and they're, to that point, doubling down. Like, they're extending work from home through the end of 2021. They've added 6 more weeks of parental time off, and they're doing a lot more, right? But I think that's just another example of it. And I think that's, they're leading from the front in that way. They're rebelling against the old models. So
I would add one thing, and one of the questions came in: how can you spot mental health issues with your people? And this is really kind of it's a tough one, because you know, we've been studying this issue for 20 years, and people present very differently. You know, you may have an extremely nervous person that you think, oh, they've got mental health issues, and no, that's just the way they're wired. And other times you have somebody who is just calm as a cucumber, and they ghost you. You never see them again, and you've burned them out, and you didn't really know. So this comes back to what we talked about earlier. Until you have that connection with people. So one of the problems I hear with managers is they say, my people talk to me. My people are talking to me all the time. And they probably do. except about this issue. So until you are willing to really open up and be compassionate and have these conversations around tough issues, it's going to be really hard for them to open up about this issue. I don't know, Lori, what would you add on that? Or the signs of mental stress?
Yeah. And so I'm not going to talk about the training, right? Because that's unfair, because they do give us tips. But
yeah.
What we've seen just as HR practitioners, dramatic shift in performance. So what we've seen in this short period of time are individuals that were consistently solid performers taking dramatic dips. And remember, I said we've stuck with our performance review process. So material shift in performance, behavioral changes. So uncharacteristically missing meetings, being late for meetings, not being prepared for meetings. Again, not as dramatic as the performance where a missed account or a slip with a product or technology launch, but more subtle. And so as we're checking in, we're finding out. But it's almost impossible because it's so nuanced in this virtual environment. I know personally, I've camouflaged so much. As a woman, as a Black woman, in a pandemic, I've cried more than I've cried professionally. No one's seen it. No one's seen it. If I were in the workplace, clearly there would have been some noticeable thing about me. Now that's me, and I'm head of HR. I only imagine how many other people are really masking. And so I don't know if there's any tell. We just have to connect. So I spend a lot of time talking with my teams, with my clients, around literally putting the human back in human resources. That is my tagline. Everyone teases me, but we've got to make these connections, because truly, when I began speaking out about my challenges with family anxiety and depression, the fact that I personally didn't even know I had it until my daughters presented with it, did I begin to get people globally speak out. Until leaders can recognize that employees, people are reluctant to really share, and they're going to be even more reluctant to share in a virtual environment. And it's really going to take leaders to lean in and to drive home the importance of them being vulnerable, being people. They don't have to be perfect. They need to really show their teams that they're human and that we're going through this human experience together. So I don't have a lot of insight on tells other than the normal. But we can create a safe environment by just opening up.
I just want to acknowledge you just for being so real and open and vulnerable right on this call and demonstrating exactly what we're talking about. I mean, you didn't have to say that, Lori, but I mean, I think you just set a perfect example. I mean, this is a powerful few minutes right there. Just you telling your own personal story, what you've done personally. I just think I applaud you and for sharing with us and sharing with the audience. And I think that's going to continue to stand on as we socialize this and we use this as an example. So I just want to celebrate that and celebrate you in doing that. So that was amazing, really, truly impressive. So.
Yeah. And I think too, you know, what Lori's really talking about is, do your people trust you and do they feel safe? And if you've got a relationship of trust and, you know, we talk about it a lot, the psychological safety, is it going to be okay for me to let down my mask and tell you what's really going on? Because if I don't feel safe, if I don't trust you, it will never happen. It will never happen. And again, as Lori said, one of the ways you build that trust and it is to be vulnerable yourself. Say, hey, look, I don't know what's going on with you. I just want to share a couple things that's going on with us. And boy, I'm telling you, it's driving us crazy. And we've had tough days. So I just want to let you know, if you're having tough days, talk to me, because I know exactly where you're coming from. I mean, simple conversations like that go a long way to tamping down people's anxieties, making them feel safe, and be able to trust you with their careers.
So I thank you again for that, Chester. Great point. And it kind of goes with one of the questions that are here in the chat. Do we still see companies and leaders that are trying to quantify ROI on this? I mean, this seems to be so common sense, heart sense. I mean, to us, it's evident, right? And to a subset of leaders, it's evident. It's almost like we know the data will support it, but yet there are others that really want to quantify everything. It's the old models. How do we move them past that, and what's the method to that?
You know, it's interesting because sometimes people say to me in Chester, boy, you guys must work with some really bad organizations, really diseased cultures. No, they never call. And they would never get this far in this, right, Lori? Those leaders would never believe what we've been talking about today. And I don't think there's really much you can do to get through to them. What we're talking about are the people who get it, they get it. Yeah. There's also some people on the fence, right? Those people that Lori was talking about earlier, which I thought was great, was maybe you haven't needed to do this, those gaps and opportunities, because things were going so well, you just haven't needed to. Now is when you need to. So yeah, if you need an ROI, we can give you the ROI. There are lots of great case studies, there are lots of stats, but you have to try it yourself and realize this is not just a better way of managing, it's just a better way of being.
Yeah.
Well said. Well, I think with that as a great closing statement, I really just want to honor all of you for your rebel leadership, your heart-centered leadership, and the example that you're all setting in the world with your organizations, with your stakeholders. And on behalf of Life Guides, thank you for taking the time to speak with all of us and our audience, and looking forward to continuing to work with you on this crusade and purposeful work. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.